authoritative, why they're valid. Basically what I'm going to do is use what we discussed earlier, transcendental reasoning, also known as abductive reasoning, also known as spiral reasoning, which was sort of popularized by a philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant. And what I'm going to do is we're going to begin with the conclusion of the argument. The conclusion of the argument is that laws of logic exist, function, etc., and that reality is intelligible. That's the primary basis for our argument. The conclusion is reality is intelligible. That starts here. Then we're going to work backwards to figure out what would be the necessary preconditions for the intelligibility of reality. Well, one of them is that whatever would be necessary for the intelligibility of reality must be transcendent, and that it can't be part of this order. So if it's part of this order, it's subject to laws of logic, which gets back to the circularity. It's a problem. It must be non-contingent, meaning that whatever this is can't be contingent upon laws of logic, because obviously it goes back to circularity. I argue that it must be personal, and this is the claim that I think most people are going to have the biggest problem with. But I argue that it's personal because imagine, the things we talked about earlier about the contradictions. In our minds, we are more or less gods. Within the frame of our mind, we can imagine anything. We can break any law of physics we want to, do just about anything in our minds. But try as we might, we cannot imagine a square circle. Try it sometime. Just right now, go ahead and try it. Imagine a square circle. Can't
Gotcha.
Do it. Can't do it. Why is this? We have complete control and complete power in our minds, but can't imagine a squared circle. It's something as simple as that. There are other things, married bachelors and any other contradiction. Despite our ability to use our will however we so choose, we're limited, which is very strange to me. And I would argue that the only time that our minds are really ever limited are when ideas and constraints have been imposed upon them by something external to us. And when it comes to a mind, well, what's the one thing that can constrain a mind? Another mind. So, upon that basis, I think that whatever can account for the laws of logic must be personal, because it is imposing itself upon us, even though we have the ability to choose whether or not to abide by any other proposition. So, I don't think that laws themselves can account for that limitation, because laws do not have a will. Laws can't choose to do anything. They can't. They're not autonomous. They can't act upon their own decisions. So because of that, they can't impose themselves upon us. They have to be imposed upon us. So, I would argue also that this entity has to be powerful, because somehow those things have to be imposed upon us. So we end up with something that is necessary, transcendent, non-contingent, personal, and powerful, which sounds an awful lot like God. So that alone doesn't, demonstrate the truth of Christianity in particular, or any religion in particular. It just shows that if you are to presuppose the laws of logic, you have to find some way of accounting for them. And I would argue that is pretty much the only way you're going to be able to account for them, because it's the only thing that satisfies all the necessary preconditions for the intelligibility of reality, which is one presupposition you have to make in order to advance any argument whatsoever. So from there, some people argue from the standpoint of materialism that, well, wouldn't necessarily have to go from a transcendental point of view. You could have something within the world that could account for these claims, or something within nature, within laws of physics, etc., that account for these claims. I argue that is not the case, that it's not possible that is the case, on the basis that, one, you run into the problem of laws of logic. Laws of logic are by definition abstract. They are not physical things floating out in the universe. So where do they exist? If they exist in our minds, and only in our minds, then by a materialistic worldview, they would just be the result of chemical processes, and thus not authoritative. And so we could just presuppose contradictions without any problem. So I would argue that they are separate from our minds because they are imposed upon reality, imposed upon our minds themselves. Another reason is that... Sorry.
So is that a more dualistic approach then, is what I'm getting, garnering from that comment, or?
Not quite.
I want to make sure I know where you're going, because that did seem almost pseudo-dualistic to say that the laws of logic would have to be outside of the cognitive mind in order to, or at least that comment that you just made there.
They would have to be outside our cognitive mind. That's specifically.
That was more of a clarifying question than anything.
Sure. Another reason is that from a naturalistic or materialistic standpoint, natural selection does not select for truth. Natural selection selects what is most beneficial to the individual organism. And because of that, anything that a creature might be endowed with, for instance, reason, would only be the result of what was most useful. So even if we do end up with reason because it is most useful, and even if our reason corresponds to reality, ultimately we can't trust it, because naturalism does not select for truth, it selects for what is useful. So if materialism and naturalism is true, there would be no way for us to know whether or not it's true, because natural selection selects only for what is useful. So, like, for instance, if our brains are made of atoms, we would never, from a naturalistic standpoint, we would never come to know that our brains are made from atoms, because the idea of truth that leads to science, which leads to the discovery of atoms, would be, basically like burping. I mean, nothing would really have a truth value. So we couldn't establish whether or not any individual idea was true or false. It would basically just be like burping, just making a random noise. Like they're no different at that point. So I reject the idea that materialism can account for laws of logic on that basis. So that's a problem, and like I said, all of us have to deal with it. But at least from the Christian worldview, there is a way to make sense of it. That is coherent, at least. I don't know. It may not be convincing, but it's coherent. Now on to the problem of universals.
I definitely thought that said Purdue University when I first started.
The problem of universals is also known as the problem of the one and the many. The idea is that there are all these different things in our universe, and they bear some relationship to one another, in that we are all part of the universe, or inside the universe. But yet we are distinct from one another. So we are related, but we're not the same things. So what is it about each individual thing that makes it unique while still being part of this order that we see? There's no real conclusive answer to it. But there are certain worldviews that do provide potential answers to it and some that don't. So another issue, in addition to the problem of logic, we have the problem of universals. And the basic idea is that each one of us, each thing in this room, each atom of the universe is a particular. And in order for the particulars to be related to one another, you have to propose what are called universals. Universals are essentially categories. Universal is like, for instance, humanity is a universal. So John and Jim are both humans, and there is something that is common to them, namely humanity, but yet they are distinct from one another. So what is it that makes them both kind of the same, but also distinct.